Welcome. My name is Brittany Dunn. I am the COO and co-founder of Safe House Project. We are just so excited to have you all here today to talk about the intersection of porn and sex trafficking. I know that most of you are used to seeing our beautiful Alia DeWeese as the host of our webinar series, but I am very excited because today she gets to be a panelist. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists that will be joining us today. We have Venice Jardine. She is the Resource and Resource Development Manager at Fight the New Drug. She has a degree in psychology and sociocultural anthropology. She has performed both qualitative and quantitative research in France, Thailand, and the United States. As the Research and Resource Development Manager at Fight the New Drug, Venice spends her time evaluating research on pornography, then using that research to develop accurate and effective resources for people grappling with the effects of pornography in their lives. In addition to research, Venice is passionate about social issues, music, the outdoors, and boxed macaroni and cheese with hot sauce. That's Then Dr. Carolyn West is a resident fellow and professor of clinical psychology at the University of Washington, where she teaches courses on family violence and sex crimes and sexual violence. For more than 3 decades, Dr. West has been investigating gender-based violence with a special focus on domestic violence and sexual assault in the lives of African American women. As an award-winning scholar, she has written more than 90 academic publications, including Violence in the Lives of Black Women, Battered, Black, and Blue. Dr. West is an internationally recognized speaker who has given congressional briefings and hundreds of keynote addresses, workshops, and presentations, and has been interviewed by national media outlets, the New York Times and Washington Post. She's a writer, producer of the upcoming documentary film, Let Me Tell You All About Black Chicks, Images of Black Women in Pornography, and is featured in the documentary Subjects of Desire, an examination of contemporary beauty images of Black women, which is available on Starz and Hulu. Then she also has a number of academic achievements. She has won the University of Washington's 2013 Distinguished Teaching Award, 2016 Distinguished Research Award, and the first Bartley Daub Professional for the Study and Prevention of Violence. Y'all, I am feeling I have not done enough in my life with Dr. West. So thank you for being here. I personally had the pleasure of meeting her at Nikosi's event for the congressional briefing and was just impacted by so much of the value that she has from both the academic side, but also walking alongside those who have experienced sexual violence. So thank you, Dr. West, for being here. And then Alia is the Aftercare Development Director for Safe House Project and a survivor of underage sex trafficking and adult sexual exploitation. She serves as a member of the California State Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children Advisory Board. And so in this capacity, she gets to influence the policies and procedures involved in the identification and care of today's survivors. And personally, she is a major asset to our organization and one of the most beautiful people that has influenced my life and inspired me. So without further ado, I want to make sure we have time for the amazing discussion that we're going to have today. So I am going to turn it over to our panelists with a question to kick it off. In what ways are pornography and trafficking linked? And does trafficking happen in pornography?
I'll let my other esteemed panelists go first, and I'll just jump in.
Okay, I can start off if that's all right. Short answer, yes. They are linked, and there is trafficking that happens in pornography. According to cases that have been reported to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, pornography is actually the 3rd most common venue for sex trafficking, which comes directly after illicit massage businesses and fraudulent escort services. So it is actually more common than a lot of people realize. And obviously it's difficult to have like large scale studies on this topic, but qualitative research does point to the fact that this is very common in the porn industry. People are trafficked into the porn industry. There are people that willingly enter the porn industry and then are trafficked during their experiences. There are many links between the two.
Yeah, I think so often there are people who are in porn don't understand just how much pornography influences trafficking or how much trafficking influences pornography. In my experience with the porn industry, which was most of my lived experience as an adult, what I saw is that And as we know, the federal definition of trafficking is a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And in my experience, the porn industry runs off of coercion. That is just par for the course. The words that they use, the way that they manipulate performers, it fits that federal definition, and it's almost expected. Those things like, you need to do this if you don't want to be seen as difficult, if you ever want to work again, the ways that they get people to perform acts that were initially on their no list. And there is also a lot of trafficking that goes on behind the scenes of an actual porn shoot. So while someone may have shown up and agreed to do one thing, the shoot itself will be something else, and they will not feel that they have the ability to leave because of the coercion and the fraud that they've experienced from either the manager or the production company itself. And then also behind the scenes, there is oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes expectations of things to be done, or to be done, commercial sex acts to be done off camera for people who are producing, whether it be other performers or producers or managers or even the camera people themselves. And so there's a lot more that goes into the relationship between porn and trafficking than just maybe what we might think of with consumption. There's actively trafficking happening on set. Another thing that I noticed in my time there was that there are a lot of women who, and there are men also, but my experience was mostly with other female performers, that they were being trafficked offset as well. There were quite a few performers that I knew that were in the industry, in the adult film industry, but then we're also being trafficked by someone else through usually hotels and motels offset.
Yeah, and I would add to that as well that they're very linked in all kinds of complex ways, as you all just talked about. And there was a recent study that came out. It's a report, and it's called Who Buys Sex? And it was produced by Demand Abolition. So they interviewed sex buyers, and they didn't look at whether they were so much trafficking individuals, but they were purchasing sex. And they also found that a large number of them also were heavy porn consumers. So we know that those things co-occur, and they're linked in ways that we don't often talk about. I can add that name to the chat.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you so much for just both Dr. West, you sharing it from your academic perspective, and then Alia from your personal experience. Just going further on that, what about what about outside of the porn industry itself? Does the consumption of trafficking fuel porn, and what are the other connections to trafficking?
Similar to what Dr. West was already saying, we see that a lot of sex buyers are porn consumers. And there's a lot of research to show that porn consumption is associated with objectification and dehumanization. And just like we see people on the internet, it's a lot easier to bully someone when you're not seeing them in person. It's a similar principle where when you're seeing someone online, you're not seeing them as a human being. Like consuming pornography is the act of objectifying another person, of dehumanizing another person. And so consuming pornography regularly is practicing objectification. And, that we can see that manifest in more willingness to buy sex. We can see that manifest in just not really caring if people in pornography are really doing it consensually, or if there's abuse going on. There's just a lot of that objectification and dehumanization plays out in real life.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on that consent piece. And it really goes back to the question that you asked before, Brittany. When we talk about consent in porn, there's this thought process, and it's fueled by the porn industry itself, and this understanding that everyone is there consensually. Well, there's consent videos. They have to sign consent forms. There are all these things that show that the person is there and engaging in this act consensually. And as somebody who's been on, I can't even tell you how many sets in my life, I can say from firsthand experience that those consent videos are just garbage. They're, for lack of a better term, they're just not real. I've witnessed people not get their check until they're willing to give that consent video or sign that consent form, even though they had to perform things that they had initially been told they weren't going to be performed, or they did that consent video before engaging in the acts that they were later forced to perform. So they did a consent video for what their manager sent them and said, this is what you're going to do. But that isn't what happened in the scene. And additionally, the consent videos say things like, you're here of your own, no one is forcing you to be here today. And yet that has happened with a pimp outside in the car, that you're not under the influence of drugs and alcohol when a person is visibly intoxicated, or even when they're using drugs and alcohol, very hard drugs on set, just off camera from those consent videos. So that idea of consent in porn is really, it's a joke. And for many, and that isn't to say that there are people who have chosen to be there, and that isn't to say that is every single video, but it is normal in the industry for that to happen. When I've shared my experience with other performers, or other performers have shared their experience with me, I've never come across someone who has said, I've never seen that happen. It's always been like, oh yes, either that happened to me, or I remember that happening to another person. And that normalization that Venice is talking about, and I know that we all probably have a lot to say on that. If you even look at titles of porn videos, things on Pornhub, things wherever, the most depraved acts, the things that we would never say out loud to another person, are there in the video. The things that they call performers, the acts that they promote. There are whole genres of porn around incest. There are whole genres of porn around intentionally trying to make someone look underage and innocent. There are whole genres of porn that are around viewing interracial sex as violence. The way that the porn industry promotes their own experience is to promote things that culturally and psychologically and in our hearts we feel are wrong. The rape, the brutal violence are things that they use to promote the experience. And so when we look at the things that people who maybe aren't trafficked in porn, but are trafficked through other avenues, the things that they experience, we see that oftentimes they line up to what is being promoted in porn.
Yeah, and I would have to add to that. Thank you so much for those insights. But seeing the same thing in the research as I've turned my attention to understanding the porn industry and the images that they produce, that's what I've been focusing on recently in my research. And I can make all of that available to you through my website. But looking at the content of just contemporary porn, I was just really struck with how it intersects with trafficking in some really disturbing ways. And then when you add race on top of that, it's even worse, the racism in pornography. I think because it's a stigmatized form of media, so they just feel like they can say or do whatever in pornography that they could not in mainstream media. But where I find the links between pornography and trafficking, I noticed that Black women were more likely to be depicted as prostitutes and sex workers than other racial groups. And so you'll see titles like Ebony Sex Worker or Black Girls Work in the Street. They're really selling that. That just becomes a selling point. And they're smearing Black women as inherently sex workers and prostitutes. And so there was one porn series that's been around for 17 years. You don't make 17 years of Black street hookers because it's selling well. And that's why you're going to have this series around for 17 years. And so Black women depicted that way. I also found in my research disturbingly that pornography really seems to sexualize domestic minor sex trafficking. So it's like underage children being sold for sex. And so the porn industry seems to normalize or sexualize that. So you'll actually see titles like Pimp My Black Teen or Exploited Black Teen. They come right out and say in the titles that this is what it is that they're doing. And I also found that pornography seems to sexualize risk factors that put girls at risk for being trafficked. So things like running away from home. So you'll see titles like Little Black Runaway, and it's okay to sexualize them and traffic them because they just run away from home, or girls who are in foster care or girls who are impoverished. So the pornography really normalizes that. And so if buyers are consuming lots of porn, I started to ask myself, what are they consuming? They're consuming a product that says this behavior is normal, acceptable, appropriate, and these young women seek this kind of treatment. So we have to understand how those things are linked.
And this starts really young too. Like most kids are exposed to porn by the time they're 13 years old, a lot of them long before then. Then we see, I just want to check my notes, so I'm making sure I'm getting the numbers right, but an estimated 91.5% of men and 60.2% of women report that they've consumed pornography in the past month. So this is most people consume porn, and most people consume porn regularly to some extent. So it's very normal, and this is the type of content that they're consuming. These are the narratives that are being normalized, and it's unsettling.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And what I've found in talking to other survivors, and then also in my own experience, is that that dehumanization piece that comes that's like part of the most transferable to trafficking. It's one of the biggest pieces in which this fuels trafficking. I was having a discussion with a group of other survivors recently, and it wasn't specifically around porn, but porn is one of the places that we can see this happen, where people are being portrayed as food. Like people are being compared to food, the way that they're described. Like we'll use tamale to describe someone or something along those lines. And just the dehumanization that comes from, you stop even talking to this person as if they're a human, or being asked to look at this person as if they're a human and they're just something that's made for consumption, like food. And that in porn titles all of the time.
Just dropped in the chat a recent study that I just wrote on porn consumers of color, because nobody seemed to really be looking at that. So I wanted to really review the research there, because there tends to be more violence in porn featuring people of color, wondering what were the implications of that. So more violence is directed at, for example, women of color in porn. Men of color in porn are often showed as perpetrators of violence, and what were the psychological implications of that. So I dropped that into the chat, and that's also available on my website, which I'll share with people as well if you want to read more of that content.
And then something that Jillian just put in the chat was that many of the survivors, the youth survivors, talk about how their abusers showed them porn and made them reenact it. And that is a point that I think that we all touched on in our pre-call as well. And I think is important to, if we're talking about how porn fuels trafficking, that is a huge way in which it does. I mean, it was not just trafficking, but child sexual abuse and those other things that create risk factors for someone to be trafficked. Porn is so interwoven, most likely in someone's life before they're trafficked or while they're being trafficked, as a way to normalize, as a way to use what the porn industry is using to normalize it for everyone else. It's used in the same way for those who are being trafficked, to normalize the violence, to normalize just the act of being sexually exploited, and to give them something. I know my lived experience was that if the person who was showing me porn as a teenager in order to traffic me, was definitely painting the narrative in my mind that this is how I could be successful if someday I was one of these women in porn, that look how beautiful they are, look how incredible they are, look how famous they are, and this is what they have to do to get that, and you can have this too, was the narrative that I was being given. And I know I'm not alone in that. So it's not only for the consumer of the buyer, but actually for the victim themselves. Porn is being used to normalize that act.
So it's all linked in all kinds of very complex ways, I find. That, so we think about trafficking, and we have to also realize it's not just pimps out there, but gangs are involved in trafficking, family members are involved in trafficking, children as well. And it all thrives on silence, secrecy, and shame and vulnerability of survivors of this. And the porn industry knows that. So they'll target people who are maybe sexualizing themselves on social media and say, here's a great way to make money, and then reach out to young people that way as well too. So it gets very complicated very quickly. And I've also seen pimps also or trafficking people and then post those images on porn sites as well. And so the links there, I guess my bottom line is that we cannot think that porn is a separate issue that's legal and that's not related to trafficking. And we have to think about all the complexities there.
Absolutely. And the reality for someone who has been, for one, there is an illegal side to the porn industry as well. Dr. West was just stating, not all of the trafficking that happens that ends up on a porn website happened inside of the porn industry. There are absolutely people whose victimization and whose trafficking, even without that formalized porn industry, ends up on sites like Pornhub. And whether it was an illegal shoot or not, to get those things taken down as a survivor of trafficking is almost impossible. Don't know that everyone knows how the porn industry works, but you don't get royalties from, even if you're in the mainstream porn industry, you don't get a royalty every time your video is watched or when it reaches a certain amount. You're given a flat amount on the day of production. That's what you're given. Your manager takes a chunk of that. And then that video, as we know, the internet is out there for that forever. That video is able to be accessed forever, regardless of what you realize in your life later on. If you realize that anything just as simple as, oh, I actually don't want that to be seen, to, I was actively being trafficked in the most horrendous way, it does not matter. It's even more difficult for somebody who was trafficked in the legal porn industry to get something taken down, because that the rights to that video were gone, and it's near impossible. I know my experiences that I've had, I'm lucky enough to, unlike a lot of porn survivors, not have my actual name, Alia Deweese, linked to my name that I used in porn. I'm lucky enough to have that, whereas many of my friends do not. However, I've had people like take photos off of my Instagram when I had social media of me and my kids and post them on Reddit threads, trying to find my videos and posting my videos on there when they were able to match my face and my tattoos to my videos. And so the ability to like separate yourself from your trafficking experience, if you were trafficked in this way, is so difficult because it's constantly there. I have experienced this, and other survivors of being trafficked in porn have experienced this, where our grandmothers get sent videos, boyfriends get sent videos. Like, I have a friend who was in porn, or her husband still 15 years later gets sent videos of people, of her porn shoots. People send them to him. The ability to walk away from your victimization is so hard, and it's there forever. And the knowledge that you as the performer know what was going on in your life, you know what was going on offset, you have the memories of what that day was. The people who's consuming that video do not, but you get to have the understanding, you get the gift of knowing that everyone who watches that video was seeing you at that time in your life, and they were watching some of the most difficult in your entire life. And it's almost like a re-trafficking experience, that re-victimization that happens just from the knowledge that people are still consuming your trafficking. Yeah, it's an interesting experience by far.
Yeah, we recently did a video interview with one of the Jane Doe, one of the victims from the Girls Do Porn case, which is a famous case at this point, but just as an overview, at least 400 women were involved in this, some of them consensually, but it's pretty much impossible to know how much of it was consensual. But this was a channel that was in one of the top channels on Pornhub. They were an official partner of Pornhub. They were verified. Everything looked like it was above board, but they would lure women into modeling contracts. So this Jane Doe that we interviewed, she was told that she would be doing sort of a fitness photo shoot. She showed up, they picked her up. She was forced to sign a contract without reading it, really, and then they physically forced her to stay in the room and raped her for an entire night. And she attempted to run away naked from this room several times, and she was physically trapped. She was psychologically trapped there. And still to this day, because these porn sites had download buttons, even though these producers have been charged with sex trafficking. Some of them are in jail. One of them is on the FBI's most wanted list, and he's still on the run. But even after all of that, her videos and the videos of all of these other women are continuously uploaded and re-uploaded to these sites because so many people have downloaded them. There's not a good enough system in place to prevent these videos from being uploaded. Obviously, this situation was completely non-consensual, but even for people who consensually participate in porn and then later decide, I want to revoke my consent, it's almost impossible, which isn't true consent. Because if you can't take back that consent for what you've done, and if those videos are continually uploaded over and over again with your legal name, with your information, sometimes your address, things like that, it's impossible to get out of.
And if we want to touch on the contract for a moment, like there's another place that federal definition of trafficking comes in, is in that fraud piece with the contracts. Again, this isn't to say that every porn contract is fraud, but when you have an 18, 19, 20-year-old who's never experienced any sort of contractual law class there, and you expect them to sign something that has an impact on their entire lives without any sort of legal representation, you're expected to sign your contract upon your contract being presented. You're not really given the opportunity. Maybe you could ask to go and take it to a lawyer to look at it, but I've never heard of anyone doing that, because you're 18, 19, 20 years old. You don't understand that. You understand these people who are talking to you, who are telling you about their experience. You most likely have certain risk factors that are similar to those that are risk factors for trafficking. And this contract is only presented to you in the way that the manager orally presents it to you. And the things that you're promised, the things like being able to leave a shoot, the things like not having your no list violated, things like that, being able to know what you're going to do before you go to a shoot. While you're told those things verbally, those aren't the things that are in your contract, but the way that it's presented to you makes it seem as if all of that is in this document you're signing. But really, all that is in the document that you're signing is that how much you are going to be paying your manager and other people who may be taking a cut of that check, the expectations on you, and all rights to your performance. So it's not a contract at all to protect that performer, outside of maybe the STD tests, which are not always done as above board as they are presented, but really it's to protect the production teams and managers involved.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies, so much for sharing that. I have one question that I think is a little bit off script from what we had planned, but I think it's one that's really important to touch on. And with the stat that shared just about how many people are consuming porn, and now that makes it so much more accessible to kids at a much younger age. What are you all seeing from the research side around how those kids are then growing up with a normalized view that these interactions are okay and what to expect? I know I had a mom the other day tell me that she didn't see it as that big of a deal that her 8-year-olds are watching XXX porn already, and just the desensitizing that does to that next generation. So when we're talking about prevention of trafficking, so much of that starts with when we hear community members say, I want to combat trafficking. What are you doing within your home that might be damaging the kids within your purview to not have a good, healthy perspective on what the link between pornography into sex trafficking and other forms of sexual violence? So would love to have you all just talk about how that rewires a child's brain.
So it can make it children don't developmentally have the capacity to make sense of what they're seeing. They don't understand that it becomes their template for what sex should be. And pornography is clearly an inappropriate template for healthy sexual relationships. There's a group called Culture Reframe, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And they actually have a program where they help parents talk about children who are exposed to pornography. So it's not there. You don't find healthy templates for what sexuality can be through pornography. There's racism in pornography, there's violence in pornography. It is not an appropriate, oh, thanks, I see the Reframe organization there. It shows aggression. So it's not an appropriate source of sex education, although there are some scholars who are talking about porn literacy and that we need to be having conversations with children because they are going to be exposed to porn outside of their home through friends or whatever, so that they understand what they're seeing and they feel comfortable talking with you as a parent about that.
There are a lot of studies that show that kids and young adults, sometimes we hear the argument, oh, it's just fantasy and everyone knows it's just fantasy, but that is not actually true according to the research. The research shows actually 1 in 4 young adults find pornography to be, or they think that pornography is the most helpful source to learn about sex. So that's before sex educators, that's before medical professionals, that's before their partners. They think porn is the go-to source for sex education, which is not great. And again, a lot of kids, their first exposure to sex is porn. They've never even learned about sex. They don't even know what sex is, and they're exposed to pornography. And so that's their first introduction to what sex is like. We receive messages from people sometimes. One message, for example, was this woman saying that the first time she had sex with her partner, he spit on her and she reacted. She was very surprised by that and reacted strongly. And he was so surprised. He had no idea. He was like, oh, was that wrong? Was that not sexy? And he just had no idea because that was how he was exposed to sex. That's what he thought people liked. And we see that a lot with the rise of strangulation during sex, of rough sex. There are all sorts of these things that are common in pornography that people are that are becoming more common in real life sexual situations, likely because of how common it is in pornography.
And people aren't feeling like they can say no to those activities, which is really problematic. I think we have to understand the porn industry has really changed, particularly with the internet. It's more immersive, high definition, 3D porn. It's the Wild West out there or something. But it's more, and we don't know what that's going to do to people's brain development if you are being exposed to that content throughout your early developmental processes and what that will do to people over time. And so that is really chilling to me as a psychologist and researcher.
And again, like the evidence that pornography is so effective at normalizing these sex acts and dehumanization and objectification is the fact that's one of the go-to tactics for abusers or traffickers or whoever it may be, that they are showing kids or young people pornography in order to just desensitize them to what they're going to experience or desensitize them to the fact that it's not normal to be treated that way. And so there are entire generations growing up and seeing this from porn. But we're also seeing a pushback. Interestingly enough, I see especially like Gen Z women, there's this pushback of, no, if I don't want to do this, then I don't want to do this. Then I shouldn't be expected to do it just because you've seen it in porn or just because it's supposedly more sexy if I want to be degraded in this way. Yeah, we're also seeing a pushback against that.
So that's really encouraging. I think that there is definitely we're seeing kind of these two thought groups really come out on this. And that's really, I think the fact that the discussion is being willing to be had at so many levels is progress. Like as hard as this is, the fact that we are starting to talk about it and really hopefully build that awareness of the impacts of porn in lives. And I think where we have to continue to build the argument is like National Center for Missing and Exploited Children during COVID saw a 35.5% rise in child sexual abuse material created during that time frame. My co-founder and some of our team are up at the UN today with the World Health Organization, and they were just releasing the numbers that are stating that now an estimated 27 million people are trafficked around the world, up from 24 million. With 90,000 being identified, which means that 1% estimation of identification is actually sitting closer to 0.32% of human trafficking victims identified worldwide now. And so with those overlay of the increase in CSAM and the heightened impact of human trafficking, we have to see where there's just these high intersection points and help bring that conversation to light around why this is happening and how it is happening in order to really get on the prevention side of it. I really appreciate you guys just highlighting the different levels that we have to combat this at. So I guess we've had a few questions in the chat. I want to bring this one. With the rise in popularity of self-produced porn like OnlyFans, how are you seeing its intersection with trafficking?
So I wish I could say that OnlyFans was a completely safe option. I really do wish I could say that, but there have been a number of reports that have shown that is not the case. We've just seen a switch. There are more traffickers moving to OnlyFans. It's interesting because OnlyFans is supposedly a platform where people can create their own content and manage their own content, but we see a lot of OnlyFans managers, which there shouldn't be a need for OnlyFans managers necessarily. This isn't just people managing the performer's social media or something like that. They're taking a cut of their pay. They're telling them what to do. And there was a recent report that said, in fact, maybe I'll just put the exact numbers in the chat once I have them. I'll look it up because I don't want to misspeak, but there's a shocking number of trafficking victims on OnlyFans and people whose traffickers are running their accounts for them.
Great, thank you. How do we explain to people who watch porn, but also maintain healthy sexual relationships that are not engaged in trafficking? Like, how do we help people reconcile those two?
And I think we can't ever put everything in one bucket. There's always going to be, just in the same way that there are people who engage in consensual sex work, who don't, not everyone fits every mold, but that doesn't account for the larger percent. Like, we can't use the people that are able to be healthy to discount the people who have experienced the unhealthy sides of things. We can't use the woman who walked into porn with a master's degree and walked away a year later with all of this money and no trauma to say that the 18-year-old who walked in, who had been trafficked since she was by her family and had all of this trauma and was continually trafficked in porn, that her experience didn't matter because there are these other people who experienced it differently. We can't use one against the other. We have to look at the porn industry and every other industry in the light that if there is even one person who is being trafficked in that, if it is fueling the trafficking of one person, then is it worth it for the people to consume porn or engage in porn in a way that doesn't affect them negatively if there are still those that are being.
And I think it's just really complex. I think it's about asking who has problems, why, and under what circumstances. And some people may think that they're healthy, but that's also questionable. And there may need to be some reflection there as well. It is really complicated. And we can concede that there are lots of people who consume porn, watch porn, and don't have a problem with it, but it doesn't negate, as you said, there are many people who do have problems with it, and it is harmful in other ways. So addressing that as well.
I feel like it's like I can use heroin every 6 months and be okay. And so why is it just not okay when we have people dying of overdoses? I don't have the numbers, but lots of people every day dying of overdoses. We can't say that the thing is not harmful because there is someone who's able to engage in it in a way that isn't harmful.
Yeah, everybody who smokes may not get lung cancer, but it doesn't mean that smoking is necessarily the best thing that you could be doing either.
And I think that's the point, is that it is impossible to know just how many people in porn are trafficking victims, or even maybe not trafficking victims, but being exploited. It's impossible to know. But I think that's why we need to be careful about it, because you have no idea. You have no idea when you're watching a video if it was completely consensual, if everyone is of age. You have no idea. It's impossible to know. And I think a lot of people say, oh, I don't watch porn that looks like trafficking might be happening. But as I think most of the people on this call probably know, trafficking isn't usually like a kidnapped off the streets, I'm forcing you into something situation. It's not going to look like trafficking. In fact, a lot of trafficking victims in porn have no idea that they're trafficking victims, but there is exploitation happening. And of course, there's porn where there is no exploitation happening theoretically, but it's impossible to know.
Absolutely. And that goes for very mainstream porn that is very well produced. I have a couple of friends who were some of the top performers when they were in porn, who are now out, who are now activists in this field, or maybe the anti-porn field. And we've done Fight the New Drug panels together and things like that. And even in those very top levels of the highest earners, the most viewed porns, the highest production quality, they were experiencing exploitation. They were being raped off set. They were being trafficked. I don't want to give people's names, but one of the top female performers in the world was going to shoots, and then she was being trafficked in a motel afterwards for very small amounts of money. These things continue to happen regardless of the way that it looks on set. And I think another thing to mention is when we hear from performers like, this is empowering, I'm not being affected as a performer, this is incredible, I want to hear where they are 10 years out and what they're saying, because that narrative, that empowerment narrative, is given to performers by those who are making money off of them. And in order, at least my experience and the experience of many of the people that I know who have been out for a little while, is we look back and we think we just wanted to feel that it was true, because so much inside of us was hurting, and so much it felt so much like exploitation, that if we could convince ourselves of that empowerment narrative, then we could feel okay. Where another really vocal friend of mine went to the Capitol building here in California and spoke upon how empowering the porn industry was, and how much this sex work was real work, and how visible she wanted to be. But she writes in a book that she released how the whole time she was there, she was just looking at these women that were at the Capitol for work and thinking, if only I got to wear clothes to work, if only I had a job like this instead of something like that. And you just don't know what is fueling the word that is coming out that's making someone say that they are being empowered. There's so much more under the surface that we can't just take those things at face value.
Alrighty, we have another question. Okay, in the conversation of legalization or decriminalization of commercial sex, where does porn lie? Any advocates for legalization or decriminalization that addresses the porn industry as well? It's a big one. We are going to do a full webinar on the decriminalization piece. So I would say feel free to just go high level on where you guys think the intersection piece is within pornography, because we will be doing that in November, right, Alia? I think it's November. So we are going to be hitting on that topic for a full session. So what do you all see as that intersection, though, between that conversation and pornography?
I'll just say pornography is legal right now. So that's the main thing, really.
That's what I see, is that it's used as the blueprint for that. It's a really poor blueprint when we look at the fact that you can get a bad test and still go and perform. You can get a bad test and perform legally or illegally. And as we're talking about here, there's still the illegal side of the porn industry. There are still people who contract HIV in the porn industry. There are still performers who are being raped. It's not a good blueprint for what legalized sex work looks like. If this is what it's going to look like all over the place for every form of sex work, I don't see how it's going to be helpful to anyone.
Yeah, it's having studied the sex industry in the Netherlands and talked to women who are in the industry there. I don't know if you can ever separate an element of violence from it, because even when it's legal, people who can't participate in the legal industry or then are going to continue to do it and be victimized or vulnerable. I don't know legalization or decriminalization makes all of that go away. It's not really a choice if you have no choice. If you have the choice between living and being impoverished or living on the street or not being able to feed your children or provide basic necessities for you, and you choose to engage in this, is that really a choice? I don't know that people give the impression that if we just decriminalize it, legalize, then all these problems will go away. And I'm not seeing that.
Thank you. I know that is a big topic and one that has a lot of depth to it. And so, yes, we will re-tackle that in November. Just as we start to wrap up this month's webinar, are there any other thoughts that come to mind that you, or if you wanted to give one kind of good takeaway to our attendees, what would that be?
For me, one takeaway, when you're working with survivors, asking them about how porn has played a role in that. I'm talking more to survivors of domestic violence, for example, and seeing how pornography has played a role in their victimization, either the perpetrator making them watch porn or forcing them to perform in porn. I think really just having the conversation about how pornography interacts with all the different forms of violence that we're seeing and giving people space to articulate that.
Yeah, I would just say these are real people. They're not just anonymous faces on the internet. They're real people that will carry this with them for the rest of their lives. And I will say, and as a maybe another encouraging piece, there was a study that found that while most people just don't really think about whether or not, most porn consumers don't really think about whether there is exploitation happening in the porn industry, when they do learn about it, 70% of them take some sort of action to combat it. So I think the type of awareness that we are raising on this issue is important because, like we've already touched on, the reason that this content exists is because there's a demand for it. So if we can stop the demand at the root, then that is how we kind of change this issue culturally.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'd leave would be having conversations, like really encouraging people to have conversations with youth around porn, like Dr. West was stating, especially youth that are at risk for exploitation, but really any youth, because the conversations that we're having with youth, I hope and I see are the conversations they have with each other. And while you may be able to have those conversations with your child or with a young person in your life or with the young person that you're serving, there are likely many youth that they come in contact with who aren't having those conversations in a healthy way or that are being exposed to porn in a way that is harming them, whether it be through trafficking or just through their brain development, and that it's not fair of us to expect them to do the research and just know that porn is harming them and others. But it's our job as the adults to change that culture and to set them up with a better understanding. That understanding is going to come from somewhere.
Awesome. Yeah. And there is a book that I put in the chat earlier from Defend Young Minds about even that. And I've read it with my as young as my 3-year-old. Like, it's called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior. There's a older version. I know there's lots of other resources that will also provide on that, but it's just helping kids feel comfortable saying when they see something that they don't feel comfortable about. So that really goes towards that prevention piece that everybody's talking about, because we all know that there's such a deep intersection between trafficking and pornography. And so, to Venice's point, if we can really start to raise kids that know how to say no to something and not be influenced by that, then hopefully we can change the trajectory of trafficking and sexual violence and change the narrative around the disproportionate number of people of color that are being impacted by the porn industry and by the narratives that have been woven into just the fabric of our nation. So I just want to thank each of you, Venice, Dr. West, Alia. You all have brought just such a wealth of information, from lived experience to research and just personal expertise, working alongside individuals every single day. And we are so grateful for each of you giving your time today. Thank you for everyone who joined us. I look forward to seeing you all next month.